It's not uncommon to hear chatter about a potential coup within Russia and a plot to overthrow Vladimir Putin. In fact, it's so common that a lot of people have actually begun to discard the idea entirely because there have been so many rumor mills and so many boy crying wolf type scenarios. But what is extremely uncommon is to hear a lot of chatter about a potential coup within Russia among Russian media channels. For example, among Russian Telegram or among Russian social media, where currently we are seeing a lot of chatter that something is going on within Russia and potentially there might be a plot to overthrow Vladimir Putin or potential purges within the upper echelons of Russian society. When we hear this, of course, our radars go up, because I think most people understand that the fastest path to a lasting peace in Ukraine is actually to have Vladimir Putin removed from office one way or another. Ukraine themselves definitely understands this, as they have had plots to actually assassinate Vladimir Putin in the past that they didn't follow through with because the US government basically told them not to. But when we look at situations like an internal attempt against Russian power, that is much different, and it's something that increasingly, the longer the war goes, becomes more and more plausible as the Russian economy winds down because of the war in Ukraine, as Russia suffers more and more casualties, and as the elite within Russian society become more and more nervous about losing their wealth and their position through what to them looks like a mindless campaign by Vladimir Putin with no potential benefit, even if Russia wins. Because of this, of course, Vladimir Putin is paranoid about a coup actually happening, and we have seen a whole lot of Russian oligarchs falling out of windows, not just to remove them as a threat from his own power, but also to implicitly threaten anybody within a position of power who might dare to challenge Vladimir Putin. But the mere fact that this kind of thing happens so often shows that in Vladimir Putin's mind, a coup to overthrow him is a very, very real possibility. And that leads back to the interesting chatter that we are seeing in Russia currently, where Russian Telegram and Russian social media is talking about the fact that Putin is going to carry out a purge because he's afraid of a potential coup. There's chatter in Russia right now in two major forums that seems to go hand in hand together, where apparently there is chatter within the Russian military itself that a purge is coming from Vladimir Putin to try to get rid of all of the disloyal elements. And at the same time, there are rather public posts on social media openly speculating about the ideas that there could be a coup against Vladimir Putin rather soon. Personally, I think if there was an actual coup attempt against Russia, which I think there probably is somewhere, or probably multiple, I don't think we would be hearing about it until it already happened, because you hearing about it sort of makes it impossible to actually happen when you're dealing with somebody as paranoid as Vladimir Putin. So when I look at this rather open chatter about a potential coup within Russia, what I see this as is probably a Putin-led operation to try to weed out people who would actually be sympathetic to performing a coup against him. There are a lot of things to back up this theory, particularly when we look at what has happened to a lot of the elites within Russian society over the past month or so, where it really looks like there has been a concerted effort to publicly clean house. There's, of course, the famous case of a transport minister being found dead in his car just hours after being dismissed by Vladimir Putin. Then there was a case of somebody involved with Transneft falling out of an apartment building. Gee, we've never heard that one before. But there was also a rather interesting case of a deputy minister of defense of Russia who was arrested back in 2024, who just happened to finally be sentenced this last month. And when you look at all the instances together, these and more, it makes it seem like Putin is trying to make a concerted show of force right now, sending a message to the Russian elites around him: don't mess with me, it's very dangerous to your health. However, even if we operate under the assumption that these coup rumors are being intentionally spread to weed out disloyal elements, that doesn't mean the rumors themselves are insignificant. In fact, that would actually make the rumors highly significant, because it gives a really clear window into the paranoia of Vladimir Putin at this current moment. where he is clearly terrified of losing his position, which means he knows the war in Ukraine is not going well. He knows what things look like and how they will continue to look as the war progresses, and he knows that he can't possibly hold on to his power if there are disloyal elements who are actively coming against him, because he knows that they're probably likely to actually get support. You have to remember that Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia who in very recent history experienced a march against his capital city by one of his main combat commanders with the whole Yevgeny Prigozhin situation, where he took the Wagner group from the front lines in Ukraine and began marching them against Moscow. And this man, when he arrived, for example, in Rostov-on-Don, where he should have been stopped by the Russian troops in that area, he was actually greeted by those Russian troops, and they didn't resist him at all. And a lot of people came into the streets and were greeting Yevgeny Prigozhin. Obviously, people weren't extremely upset about this. People weren't extremely loyal to Vladimir Putin. And really, the only reason this fizzled out is because people were not ready at that point to actually put their own lives on the line to actually try to overthrow Putin. But it does show you that because these events have actually happened, that if Putin has paranoia, it's actually quite well placed. And that in and of itself is very significant. For example, when we look at World War II, one of the main reasons, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons the Nazis ultimately lost was because Adolf Hitler kept making just the worst combat decisions possible. And I've seen some analysis that says that part of the reason that he made such terrible decisions was because of his increasing state of paranoia. And one thing that played into his paranoia was the fact that there were assassination attempts against him that caused him to insulate himself more, to trust his own people less, to trust his own generals less, and to want to make decisions for himself rather than trusting his leadership. And so he operated, much like Putin is today, on worse information than he could have. And even when he was giving orders, he wasn't always trusting that the people around him were actually going to obey them. And so when we do a psychological analysis of Vladimir Putin being paranoid about the same things, he is in a state that is similar potentially to where Adolf Hitler was towards the end of World War II. What's the most interesting about this of all, though, is that paranoia often produces the very outcome it's trying to avoid. And that is a very real possibility if indeed Putin is trying to snuff out disloyal elements. Now, all this information we're discussing moves so fast, but it also has a very high impact. For those of us where information is a mere curiosity, it's usually just fine to be a little bit behind on the news cycle. But for others of us, organizations both large and small, and anyone trying to steer important decisions, it's vital to stay up to date on key events without missing the key details that are the most important to you in all of the media noise. For that, the world's leading firms are increasingly using modern media monitoring solutions to track and filter the news for things like trends and security risks. Like ReadPartner, who I'm delighted to have back as the sponsor of today's video. If you're not familiar with ReadPartner, you really should check it out. It makes it easy to automate news feeds using keywords to set up custom newsletter monitoring all in one place. For organizations, ReadPartner has important collaborative features, such as department-specific daily digests and executive report generation. This ensures that everyone within your organization can identify news-based opportunities and threats faster than your competitors. You are definitely part of, or know someone who is part of, a small team or a large organization that spends a lot of time manually monitoring the news to stay abreast of updates that are critical to business. So consider giving ReadPartner a try, not only to save you and your team a lot of time, but also to spot potential hidden opportunities that you and your team may otherwise never have seen. They offer 14-day zero-commitment free trials for both individuals and businesses. When purchasing a subscription, be sure to use the link in the description and my code Warburg7 to receive a 35% discount off any plan for the first 3 months. And I almost forgot to mention that their support team is super friendly and dedicated and can guide you through the platform on a zero-commitment live call if needed. All in all, thanks to ReadPartner for sponsoring today's video. And do make sure to check them out if you run a startup or are part of a larger organization in need of media monitoring solutions. Within Russia, because it's a mafia society, and all the people in positions of power understand this, the people in positions of power will recognize what Vladimir Putin is doing in his paranoia, and they may decide to make counter moves before their own lives are taken away from them. We've already seen, for example, some oligarchs trying to flee the country, but being arrested on their way out and having their fortunes confiscated. Obviously, people recognizing they need to get out while they can, and they actually failed to do so. And that kind of leaves the rest of the elites within Russia, including the military commanders, kind of trapped in a corner where they probably believe that if the war in Ukraine is lost, or if Putin descends into a further state of paranoia, that their own lives will potentially be on the line. They could be like the transport minister being executed basically for failing their czar, their leader, or they could simply be taken out as a matter of paranoia, take them out before they can get to me. And if they feel like Putin might try to do that to them, their odds of actually trying to do that to Putin on the flip side are increased. And so as we see the paranoia level increase among Russian leadership, as we see oligarchs falling out of windows more and more often, as we see more and more fortunes being confiscated, and all of these things happen, the potential for political chaos in Russia magnifies with every single step. And we already see some signs of this, that some oligarchs are moving to position themselves better for this potential chaos. For example, in a lot of regions of Russia, it is accurate to say that the Russian government has already collapsed, in the sense that the Russian government can no longer provide an adequate police force to police those regions. And so what is popping up in the place of the regular police force is basically vigilante groups, a lot of which are funded or supported by particular oligarchs or leaders. And so we see already some oligarchs carving up pieces of Russia for themselves, positioning themselves in the minds of the locals as the legitimate leaders, the ones who are actually providing the police services and things like that. And we really see the potential for that to magnify 100-fold as things progress. What's fascinating about all of this is that none of these things are by any means historically unprecedented, not even within Russia itself. In fact, a lot of the things I'm talking about are almost mirror images of what was happening in the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, where the Russian elite saw the collapse coming and they positioned themselves to take advantage of that so that they could sit at the top in the next stage of the Russian government. That is how a lot of the oligarchs who currently exist today got into power in the first place. And you have to think, I mean, if they did it once, they could probably do it again. In fact, now they only have more than 3 decades more of experience to prepare them to do that exact thing. And we do seem to see a lot of Russian oligarchs positioning themselves for the next stage of the Russian government, whatever that might be. To a lot of people, though, this still sounds kind of crazy. How could this possibly happen? And that's the thing about a coup. It seems like such a dramatic event that you can never imagine it actually happening. And yet when you look across history, it happens all the time. In fact, it seems to be the norm with peaceful, prosperous countries, especially when it comes to dictators who actually hold on to their power for an indefinite period of time. That is actually the exception. The norm throughout history is actually that dictatorships seem to end in coups, and a lot of them end in coups so quickly that we just never even hear about them. And Vladimir Putin is no exception to history. We've seen in so many ways how he has destroyed his country through the war in Ukraine, and it really would be no surprise if he became subject to the same historical forces that took out rulers that were similar to himself in the past. We have seen in so many ways how Putin has destroyed his company through the war in Ukraine. He's destroyed the Russian economy. More notably, he's destroyed the fortunes of the Russian elite. And so it should be no surprise at all if Vladimir Putin becomes subject to the same forces of history that impacted most other people like him in the past. What's so ironic about this is that this is potentially just yet another way where Putin might produce the exact outcome he was trying to avoid by trying to be a strong man and muscle himself in a different direction. Vladimir Putin, of course, wanted to be the preeminent energy supplier to Europe, and there's evidence that he was potentially threatened by Ukraine, which is one of the reasons that he decided to invade Ukraine. But it was, in fact, that invasion itself that caused Russia to stop being able to sell energy to Europe. Similarly, Vladimir Putin says he was paranoid about NATO expansion, and so he invaded Ukraine to prevent that from happening. And it turns out that invading Ukraine is what actually caused NATO to expand. And here we see in his paranoia him trying to potentially oust a coup to overthrow him before it can ever happen. Whereas in reality, this paranoia might, in the end, create the outcome that Putin is actually trying to avoid. All in all, we'll see what happens, but one thing is absolutely clear. If Vladimir Putin was really winning the war in Ukraine as easily as it seems, and overwhelming Ukraine's ability to defend itself, Vladimir Putin would not be acting in such a paranoid fashion. If he was truly confident, he wouldn't have to project confidence, he would just actually be confident. And when we look at the actual moves Vladimir Putin makes, despite the face he might project to the media, all of the actual underlying actions he takes betray his paranoia and his lack of confidence that he can actually achieve victory. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed the video, would you do me a quick favor and like this video and subscribe to the channel? Both of those things are completely free, but they help me out a lot. If you'd like to support the channel in other ways, there are a lot of links by which you can do so in the description of this video. I don't expect that from anybody, but I do really appreciate all the support you guys give me. We recently reached 200 YouTube channel members, which is a huge milestone. So thank you guys so much. And here's to the next 200. Thanks to Read Partner for sponsoring today's video. And do make sure to check them out if you run a startup or are part of a larger organization in need of media monitoring solutions.